All right, let's jump right in. Look, this isn't about getting out a crystal ball to predict the next big crash. No way. The goal here is to give you a toolkit, a way to see the mechanics behind a crisis. We're going to break down how a system gets so fragile in the first place, what the spark is that sets it all off, and most importantly, how you can start to spot those warning signs way before they become front-page news.
And this isn't some abstract academic exercise. I mean, listen to this quote. It's from the International Monetary Fund's big report in April 2025. It's a pretty stark warning from one of the world's top financial watchdogs. So when the IMF says risks have increased, that's a huge signal. It means the ground beneath the global financial system might be getting a little shaky.
So what are they seeing that maybe the rest of us aren't? What does a warning like that really mean in plain English? That's exactly what we're going to unpack. We're going to look at the exact framework the experts use, so you can start to see the financial world through their eyes.
First things first, the anatomy of a meltdown. It turns out that financial crises are not random acts of nature. Whether we're talking about 1929, 2008, or whatever might be next, they all kind of share the same DNA. There's a surprisingly predictable pattern to them.
And here is the absolute key idea. A crisis isn't just one bad day on the stock market. Not at all. It's more like the explosive final scene of a movie that's been building up for months, sometimes even years. It's all about this secret buildup of weaknesses, these tiny cracks that make the whole system super brittle, just waiting for one little push to make it all come crashing down.
And this is how it happens. It's a three-act play. Act 1, you have the vulnerabilities. This is the quiet part, where things like too much debt are building up, mostly out of sight. Then, Act 2, the trigger. This is the spark. Maybe it's a sudden interest rate hike, maybe a big company goes bust. But here's the thing. A trigger by itself isn't enough. The real damage, Act 3, comes from the amplifiers. This is the internal plumbing of the financial system that takes that initial shock and just blasts it everywhere.
I think a really good way to picture this is the crisis cocktail analogy. The vulnerabilities are all the different ingredients, a shot of too much debt, a splash of risky loans. They all get mixed together, nice and quiet over a long period of time. The trigger? That's the final shake that turns a bunch of separate ingredients into one very, very potent drink.
So what are these ingredients? What specific vulnerabilities should we actually be on the lookout for? Well, it turns out that groups like the IMF have a kind of checklist of about 10 really critical warning signs. Let's run through them real quick.
Okay, here are the first 5, and you're going to recognize some of these. Number 1, excess leverage. That's just a fancy term for way, way too much debt, simple as that. Then there's liquidity mismatch. This one's a classic trap. Imagine trying to pay your 30-year mortgage with a credit card that's due every single month. It works, right up until the moment it catastrophically doesn't. And of course, you've got your asset bubbles and shaky government policy, basically pouring gasoline on a fire that's already smoldering.
The next 5 are all about how a tiny problem can go viral. I really want you to clock number 7. Interconnectedness. This is the idea that the financial system is a giant web. You pluck a string over in one corner and the whole thing can start to vibrate. And number 8, opacity is just as dangerous. That's when nobody's really sure who's holding the risky stuff, and that uncertainty can cause absolute panic.
Okay, so that's the theory. Now let's get real. What are the specific ingredients in the crisis cocktail that the IMF is so worried about right now? Because they're not just pointing vaguely at the sky. They are flagging a very specific and dangerous combination of these factors.
So ingredient number 1 they're pointing to is leverage. But they're being super specific about where this debt is piling up. It's not in the big traditional banks this time around. It's in what's called the non-bank sector. So think hedge funds, private credit. These are the firms that act a lot like banks, but, and this is the key, they operate with way fewer rules.
And that leads us straight to ingredient number 2, which is interconnectedness. This is absolutely critical. A hedge fund taking on too much debt is a problem for that hedge fund. But the systemic danger, the real threat, comes when you ask, well, who are they borrowing all that money from? And very often the answer is the big traditional banks.
And this is exactly how that connection works. When a super-leveraged hedge fund gets into trouble, it doesn't just quietly disappear. The banks that loaned it billions suddenly have a hole in their balance sheets. The fund is then forced to sell assets to raise cash, which causes prices to crash, which then hurts everybody else who owns those same assets. It's a chain reaction, a virus that spreads from the shadows of the financial system right into its heart.
And hey, you don't have to take my word for it. This is a direct quote from that same IMF report. They are flat out saying these connections, these linkages are growing. And what that means is the potential for a problem that starts in the wild west of the non-bank world to become a problem for all of us is growing right along with it.
The final ingredient to today's cocktail is opacity. Or, to put it simply, nobody can see what's going on. It's the fog that makes everything 10 times more dangerous. Because so much of this activity is happening outside the normal regulated banking system, it's incredibly hard for anyone, even the regulators themselves, to get a clear picture of who really owes what to whom.
In fact, the IMF uses this very polite term, data gaps. It's a nice, bureaucratic way of saying, we don't know what we don't know. And when a shock hits, that kind of uncertainty is what fuels panic. Lenders get scared, and they pull back from everyone because they simply can't tell the difference between who's safe and who's about to go under.
Okay, so we've looked at the anatomy of a crisis and the specific ingredients the IMF is worried about today. So what's the big takeaway from all this? How can you actually put this knowledge to use?
If you remember one thing, remember this framework. Financial crises do not just fall out of the sky. They are built piece by piece. First, the vulnerabilities slowly, quietly create the fragility. Then, a trigger lights the fuse. And finally, the system's own internal wiring acts as an amplifier, turning what could have been a small fire into an absolute inferno.
And once you really get this framework, you're not just reacting to crazy headlines anymore. You basically have a dashboard. You can read the financial news and start asking smarter questions. Is this story about a vulnerability building up? Is that a potential trigger? How connected is this part of the system to everything else? It lets you read the health of the entire system on a much, much deeper level.
So I'm going to leave you with this question to chew on. Based on everything we've talked about, what do you think is actually more dangerous right now? A ton of debt sitting inside a big, heavily regulated bank that regulators are watching like a hawk? Or that same amount of debt hidden away in the shadows of the non-bank system where it's all interconnected and nobody can see the full picture? The answer? Well, it's not obvious. And thinking through the why, that's really the key to spotting where the next big risk is hiding.